All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this session on knowledge accumulation needs for managing overshoot of the Paris Agreement. I am Vanessa Schweitzer, and I am an associate professor at the University of Waterloo in the Department of Knowledge Integration. I would like to welcome you to this session. Give me just a moment to get my slides going. All right. And so this session is going to be interactive. You'll hear a bit more about what we're trying to achieve with this session, as well as how the session will go. What I also want to acknowledge are the people who are convening this session and where we are based. We are based in what is known as Southern Ontario by many people. And I'm affiliated with the University of Waterloo. I'm also a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And our campuses are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Ottawandaran peoples. We're situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. It's important to acknowledge the centuries-long history of where we are based, since we're having a session that is talking about confronting the long-term management of climate change, especially if we overshoot the Paris Agreement. In this session, you will also be interacting with some PhD students who are part of the Waterloo Climate Intervention Strategy Lab. Those students include Burgess Langshaw Power, Stephanie Rose Courtnovis, and Hope Elizabeth Tracy. And I wanted to give a little bit of background to the topic of this session because the Earth Systems Governance group is an interdisciplinary group. And so to make sure we have a shared knowledge base, I wanted to first provide the context for this conversation. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change guards against dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And the Paris Agreement is a part of that framework convention. It specifies that governments should take actions to limit the global average temperature change to well under 2 degrees C compared to pre-industrial temperature estimates, and ideally below 1.5 degrees C. The current amount of temperature change is estimated to be 1.37 degrees Celsius by NASA, and global emissions from fossil fuels and industry are currently holding steady. And I'd want to clarify that having steady emissions is not a good thing because carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, some of which are very long-lived, what that means is that so long as the emissions are still happening, the accumulation of carbon dioxide pollution is more like a bathtub that is getting filled with the greenhouse gas pollution. And so what we're dealing with is a situation where the bathtub is dangerously close to overflowing, and it's not as simple to fix this problem as other pollutants that have caused problems like acid rain, where they basically get removed from the atmosphere through natural processes much faster. With long-lived greenhouse gases, the time on a human timescale is much, much slower. So the rate at which natural processes will restore the atmosphere is very slow. It's like a drain in a bathtub that's clogged. And so long as emissions continue to be added to the atmosphere, the bathtub faucet remains on. So climate policies that turn that faucet down or turn it off are referred to as mitigation, and policies that do not address the faucet are interventions in other parts of the climate system. I'd also like to contextualize what did we mean when we organized this session, and we put in the title Overshooting the Paris Agreement. We're taking a broad interpretation of what this could mean. So a straightforward, perhaps legal interpretation might be that if in our monitoring of the Earth system, we find that we are in fact above 1.5 degrees Celsius of change, that would be a straightforward way to say that we are overshooting one of the goals of the Paris Agreement. But even at current levels of climate change, there are concerns that large-scale singular events, such as in this picture, what is being depicted is that there are multiple tipping elements in the climate system that physical climate scientists are concerned about. And even before we get to 1.5 degrees C, there are concerns that one of these tipping points might be triggered. And so if there is a trigger that happens that's not necessarily tied to crossing 1.5 degrees C, we imagine that there might be novel governance responses to some sort of triggering event like that would not be so different from overshooting the Paris Agreement. So this is what we would like to discuss, is this particular context and what are the needs then for Earth system governance, and what kinds of knowledges do we need to accumulate or gather in order to give governments some good policy advice on what they ought to do. So we will hear from 3 speakers that focus on different kinds of interventions, and to, again, contextualize what we mean by knowledge accumulation in the context of Earth system governance. There is a working group in the ESG that focuses on this question. And some examples of what knowledge accumulation means includes systematically recognizing and assessing institutional, political, and social contexts of governance interventions, perhaps trying to extract some generalizable patterns and trends to give general advice. But we also want to better understand when it is that our governance research is being taken up and is useful to policymakers, but also when is it not and why. And this particular session is likely to focus on that 3rd bullet, where we're exploring a topic and research questions in Earth system governance, where knowledge accumulation would be particularly fruitful to impact policy reactions and governance approaches. So the 3 speakers that you'll hear from and their discussions of different climate interventions, we have invited Dr. Juan Moreno Cruz, who luckily is also in our affiliated with our Waterloo Climate Intervention Strategies Lab. He's actually a Canada Research Chair in Energy Transitions here at the University of Waterloo in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development. And he'll discuss whether current governance and knowledge accumulation approaches that exist under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and multi-level scientific assessments are adequate to guide government policies on carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions technologies. Then we'll hear from Dr. John Moore, who is a member of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. He was also the chief scientist on the 2007 to 2009 International Polar Year Project, Kinvika. And he'll be discussing mega engineering projects as possible responses to what we have brought up in this session as potential overshoot sort of responses to what's happening in the climate system. These kinds of interventions might be categorized as adaptation to a warmer planet. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Tyler Felgenhauer, who is the research director at the Duke Center on Risk, and he works closely with the Solar Geoengineering Research Project at Resources for the Future in the United States. He will discuss the novel knowledge accumulation needs for Earth system governance of monitoring, reporting, and verification of non-CDR climate interventions. And I encourage you all to learn more about our speakers from their bio pages, which are connected to this forum. So I'll turn things over now to Burgess to tell you a bit more about what to expect during our interactive session.
So just really quickly, going to go over our plan for the next little bit. So we've had a great introduction from Vanessa. Thank you very much. We're going to go through just brief presentations from each of our speakers, just about 5 minutes each, give or take. That's just to set the stage for our discussion. Then we're going to have 3 10-minute discussions to really dive into the subjects and issues raised by each of our speakers. And this is an opportunity for everybody to, unmute, go on camera or not as you choose, or use the chat and voice some thoughts, opinions, and directions that you'd like to see research go. Then we'll have a brief summary session. I don't think we'll need nearly as much time as we've allocated for that. Just to sort of wrap up what we've heard, Vanessa will give us some closing remarks. And I just want to note one thing. So we are recording this, and one of our hopes is that some of the things we hear about today will drive us to write a little piece that gives us a direction recommending for areas for future research. So please feel free to give your comments and thoughts in that vein as well. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to our first speaker, which is Juan.
Hi, everybody. So I was thinking of what case to present to highlight this, and then what was kind of the main issue that I wanted to highlight when thinking about it, about to integrate negative emissions and CDR into climate policy and what we need and what we don't know. One of the biggest concerns on negative emissions from my perspective is how to introduce them and compare them to traditional mitigation options. That's one. And the other thing is how to measure and what to measure and what counts as negative emission. And like mitigation, a ton non-emitted is not emitted, and a ton is a ton, and that's easy. Not to verify and monitor, but to measure if we were to sell it in a carbon market. But negative emissions are more complicated because we start to ask questions of how long are they going to stay? What is the unit that we're trying to sell? But anyways, in the process of looking for this, I came out with two recent developments that are actually quite interesting to understand this. These are on CCS, not on CDR, but I think they apply. One is that in Norway, a project called Northern Lights was completed, I think, September 24th this year, or something like that, quite recently. And that project is all about selling a service. The service is to move and store carbon. And the clients are likely to be European industry polluters. That's one. The other development was that there was just the Article 6.4 under the Paris Agreement was just finalized, and it provides the standards for how to measure things in different countries and different places. So that's quite recent. So these two recent events led me to think like, okay, so if there is a project that is promising to be an important player on the negative emissions question, this idea of pure transportation sequestration service highlights two things that I think we don't know enough about. One is who is claiming these emissions? Yeah. So are these emissions actually being claimed by Norway because they're storing it, these negative emissions, I mean, or by the countries that are doing the capturing, or by both? But if it's both, then how do we deal with double counting? Yeah. And the other aspect is how do these enter in the international carbon markets, for example? And in that context, who sells the credit and whose credit belong? And are you selling the credit because you capture a ton of CO2 or because you store a ton of CO2? And this is a very down to earth, I think, seemingly boring topic of how to handle negative emissions, but I think it highlights the difficulties of actually bringing these sort of projects to market. And it is a project that, for me, was novel. I didn't know until I started to do research for today about this project at all. And the fact that it was only about transportation and storage of CO2 is also a novelty for me. I never thought of, but there's already somebody on the process. And the fact that it's already completed on time and it costs a ton of money, but Norway managed to do it, then the question is, how is it that this is not like a more common thing? And I want to parallel this with the regulatory framework, not international, at the national level of power systems. And I started to think about the system that is going to be required to create enough negative emissions, or CDR. Is going to look a lot, or is mostly a question, is it going to look a lot like power systems in which we have like generators, transmission, distribution, and demand points? Or is it going to be more distributed to begin with? Or is it going to be a service more akin to like garbage disposal in cities? And I think we don't have a clear idea right now of how it's going to work. But this international project kind of changed a little bit my perspective on what the gap is. And I thought of CDR always as having like an issue with like even how to do it locally or nationally. but how we start to think about cross-country and international transfers of negative emissions. So that's where I end now. I have some possible questions we can talk about later if you want.
Thanks, Juan. We'll put a pin in that for now. So everybody, keep your questions on top of mind. And I'm going to next ask Dr. John Moore to take over and give us a 5 minutes sort of his thoughts. And then we'll go with Tyler, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. We'll sort of do 3 10-minute sessions of discussion, give or take, and we'll go from there.
Mute. Okay, yes, hopefully you can hear me now. Right, so interesting topic I was given, and don't expect me to give you an answer on this because we're all making it up as we go along, I think, as far as we know. I have to say that it's quite a lot more complicated than managing a typical engineering project or a research program, I would say, because as well as trying to move things forwards in the science or the engineering, you need at least these 6 things that I put there. So the engineers have to, of course, make sure that they do their engineering well, that it's durable and safe, etc. Social license is incredibly important at the local level. And I think something that's a little bit neglected so far, the academic community as well has to be on board with this in a meaningful way. There's definitely some delays at the moment because of inertia in a lot of the established scientific communities. We, of course, need to think about the economics, and that's a little bit like Juan was talking about with negative emissions. If we think how this might be sold in terms of doing something to keep the Arctic or the polar areas frozen, in a sense that's keeping the albedo of the planet up. You could also think of it in terms of buying preventative sea level rise by the ice sheets collapsing. I think it's a bit simpler than the negative emissions because it wouldn't be the question of Greenland claiming the credits, if you like, but people would be supporting Greenland to steward their ice sheet. Of course, the science has to make sure that it's feasible if any intervention is done at the scale of these very large mega projects. But in order to get there, of course, you have to do field tests, and those field tests must also be useful and not just performative. They must be to find things that can't be done in the laboratory, for example, or on the computer. And then the legal frameworks for what needs to be done are very much worth exploring, and the next couple of slides I'll talk about that. I'm definitely not a lawyer or anything like that. And then finally, you have to look at the governance, which is a very key part of doing anything at high latitudes. I think it's something that is very clearly has to have both local and global benefits, and that must apply at any testing as well as the deployment scales. And fundamentally, there has to be no losers. And of course, all these things are linked together. And it's all about searching for red flags. It's not about trying to bulldoze the way forwards, but trying to get removing the failures as early as possible. This is a slide that's about the European Union's Co-Create project, which is all about the governance of primarily solar radiation management, but it also is trying to build on case studies and examples. And this is a report that was just released. It's not accepted by the EU yet, which is why it has this horrible watermark all over it. But this is quite a useful summary, about 40 pages of looking at the legal structures that exist at the moment. And of course, nothing can be done until that legal work allows it to be done. And this is especially true for field trials anywhere in particular. So it's not just talking about the typical solar geoengineering type of things, but we did a survey recently of what might be applied to the north, and we found about 60 different possibilities. And for example, this is something that I've worked on quite closely, which is the idea to try to conserve the ice sheets by preventing too warm seawater from eroding their bases on the land. And the idea is to build slowly. You wouldn't try to get into Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, which would be incredibly a challenging prospect. But then how do you get there? You have to go through the Arctic. And of course, there are large numbers of people, 4 million people living in the Arctic. So that presents a whole set of different challenges that have to be met. So that includes local social acceptability and, of course, the governance aspects as well. But it's essentially 1,000 times cheaper to do things in the Arctic than it is in the Antarctic. So it's well worth doing. And I think in terms of building a community that can try to look at this, it's worth thinking about ways that you can do it without any engineering at all. I just highlighted one of our research fields here, which is just trying to use natural analogs and in a way build confidence, especially in the biological community that are very much unwilling to get involved in this at the present state. And again, you look for off-ramps as you go. It's not about really trying to push things through in the easiest way, but trying to find ways of which you can definitely prove that what you're trying to do won't work. Of course, this is a little bit tricky to do from a personal point of view, but it should be done. It's responsible management. And I think also you need to have clear ideas of what constitutes a success as you go. And I think in terms of sea ice interventions, this is different from what I was talking about my own project. I think there's a couple of presently running programs that have done quite well in terms of engaging with local communities and starting from very small scale tests, as you can see here, but it's very important not to try to do these in isolation when we think about some of the mistakes and missteps that have been done in the stratospheric aerosol kind of interventions, but to do things with the local communities from the very start. So I'll wrap it up there.
Great, thank you, John. And with that, let's move to Tyler.
Thank you, Burgess, and thank you to you and Vanessa for the organization. I'm sharing my screen. I plan to give a brief snapshot of some current work that we're doing with the Duke Group, and some of you here on the call are also involved in this, looking at the needs and objectives for international monitoring of potential solar radiation modification. Just to get into it, the motivation for this work is based on the premise that is probably nearly universally held, that if there is any solar radiation modification going forward, that both the benefits and the risks could be managed most effectively with some sort of international, effective, cooperative, and representative governance regime. You see below on the graphic there, the gray area shows that international SRM governance encompasses many different capabilities that are required, things that would have to happen, possibly new institutions, from assessments to enforcement to decision-making, liaison with other organizations, oversight and management, transparency, etc. This work is motivated then by the fact that in order to govern, we need to know what's happening with any deployment. So the focus of this work is SRM monitoring for the purposes of governance. In essence, we can't govern what we don't understand. We need to understand what's going on first. And you see it on the upper left there, the red box. We define SRM monitoring as very simply just understanding how SRM is or might be used to modify the climate. With that information then, sort of a fuzzy boundary where the information gathered can feed into the rest of the governance system, can feed into climate systems modeling, can feed into the impacts observation, public outreach, eventually to full scientific assessments of the SRM deployment, and then really the key point of governance being able to make decisions on that deployment. There'll also be many interactions with the monitoring and data sharing and transparency, model improvement, and the review of the methods to monitor itself. We've been organizing our thinking on this, and this is based on a workshop that we held last spring at Duke in Durham, organizing it on basically 2 domains across different stages of any potential SRM deployment. The 2 domains being the physical science and technical capabilities that we would want to have in terms of understanding, observing, tracing, detecting. This is things like the satellites needed, the airplanes needed, the ground-based observation, the other methods to collect intelligence or have it reported. And then, so that's one domain. The other one is the political and institutional domain. What are the institutions required or that might already be existing that we could use to understand an SRM deployment, from going from left to right, all the way from a pre-deployment stage where nothing's happened yet, but we might be anticipating that some entity is preparing to deploy, to field experiments. At what level can those be detected? So you might be able to observe those from your desk or just through basic desk research, but you might not be able to detect them physically until much later, especially if they're small. Early deployment might be different, require different monitoring capabilities than a more mature deployment. And then, of course, a phase down as the ultimate goal. So for each of those stages, we want to know what are we trying to measure? What information exactly do we seek and why? And how is this going to be obtained? I mentioned that already, the methods. And then what sort of international monitoring arrangements exist now that we might be able to lean upon, buttress, or what entities do we need to create? Where are the gaps? This research is really exciting on our part because we're hoping to actually have this lead to something real. It has the potential to lead to some sort of international diplomatic consultations on where existing organizations to start might want to have this under their mission. So from the Duke workshop, we established a more detailed timeline, and I won't go into the whole set of the matrix here at all. This matrix also continues further down, but we looked at definitions of various stages of monitoring, observation targets, the governance purpose, and existing methods. For simplicity here, I'll just go through the basic definition. And you can again think of this in terms of the timeline, roughly the timeline or the scale of a deployment. First, we want to know what a baseline SRM, the pre-baseline stratospheric conditions are in order to compare what might happen in the future. We want to observe this observation might be actually just looking at planes taking off or looking at statements made by entities wanting to do this before a deployment happens. And then what is the smallest amount of an SAI deployment or we've been focusing on stratospheric aerosol injection, but it could also apply to other SRM approaches. Detecting that deployment through the most precise methods available, characterizing it, understanding, well, what is going up into the sky, both what do we observe and what might be reported in case the actor doing this is acting cooperatively. And even if the actor is acting cooperatively, you'd want to have multiple ways of verifying that information. Tracing it as it goes around the globe, projecting then the actual effects on aerosols in the stratosphere, checking the efficacy, substantiating, and evaluating. I'm just going through these quickly because it really is getting into the weeds of the paper. But eventually, we'd want to have some sort of full set of information that could be fed into a larger assessment that's based both on the monitoring, but also on looking at impacts on the ground and climatic impacts that we observe. So the takeaways from this work to this point, we're arguing that early attention to monitoring could be a no regrets, high return policy that would be essential for anticipating, understanding, and governing a potential SAI deployment in an internationally cooperative way. The objectives that could be met first, we'd want to be able to detect as soon as possible any unilateral or non-cooperative SAI activities in advance, thus helping to avoid international conflict. And then over a longer term, perhaps in a cooperative setting, we want to understand we want to be able to assess the multiple characteristics and risks and impacts of any deployment to improve the scientific understanding of what's going on, but for the governance purposes, to inform decisions on that deployment. So more specifically, we could allow for the assessment of the assessment of the impacts. This is really where the second bullet point at the bottom there is really where it gets into the management of the program, adaptive policy learning. And some of these decisions that we could imagine some future governance regime trying to tackle is basically whether to deploy, how to deploy, when to deploy, how much, and to then be able to assess, is that deployment working? How does it need to be tweaked, or should it be stopped? Finally, a very important capability that could be had with monitoring is being able to assess, helping to be able to assess claims of adverse impacts from SRM to get to this really challenging question of informing attribution of SRM effects on particular regions, knowing that that's a very big challenge. There are many other considerations I'll briefly list here. The monitoring could help feed into the modeling improvements. There would be scientific co-benefits to monitoring. Just for the purposes of time, I'll just highlight the fact that one of the key questions, and perhaps this could be a discussion for this group, is what are the most relevant current monitoring agencies or entities that work on this, and which could be the most logical candidates going forward? Also, what examples in the past with other regimes, such as with Montreal or nuclear weapons proliferation or other international issues, what sorts of monitoring arrangements have worked well in the past that we might be able to borrow from for the SRM case? I want to thank the participants at the Duke workshop and previous meetings, and also previous session participants who've given a lot of great comments so far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So that was an awesome little thing to set the stage for our discussion. We obviously don't have enough people where we need to do breakout rooms, so I was going to leave everybody together. And I wanted to, turn first to Juan's session. And we do have some pre-prepared questions, but rather than diving straight into those, I wanted to open the floor to anybody, whether that be other panelists or audience members, to unmute, ask questions, raise provocations, and that sort of thing. So open floor, if anybody has anything they want to start with.
I want to pose a possible question. So drop it if you need to. But so suppose that we are doing climate policy globally, and we have a bunch of options. And somebody comes to you with like a project like Northern Lights. Somebody comes to you with a project like one of the projects on the Arctic that John was mentioning, and somebody comes to you with some, let's call it marine cloud brining project. How do you compare them in terms of climate policy? How do you actually combine them? How do we think about them together? Yes, the question. I don't have an answer.
I think there's two answers maybe to that question. I think there's going to be the people that say, well, which one's going to have the most impact, or is like feasibility, scalability, and removal potential. And then you're going to have the people that say, okay, which one has the least risks and take a precautionary approach. And so it's really like those two discourses interacting. And I think increasingly we're going to start seeing more risk taking and less precautionary measures. So it's really about getting ahead of that to make sure that we're not taking on adverse risks. But
I
yeah,
will say there is also a third possibility, and it is that we consider them as part of a portfolio. And in portfolio you can invest on different stocks to minimize risk. So it is possible you could do something like this as well as a third option. Yeah.
I think in terms of how it's balanced, then you can look at things like this rebuttal to the non-use agreement that Ted Parson and others wrote, where it's very important to look at the trade-offs between doing an intervention and not doing an intervention, because doing nothing is not cost-free or risk-free by any, especially when you cross these tipping points. Effectively, in this review that we made, we tried to find, we came up with 12, but you could have any number, I suppose, of directions or dimensions that you wanted to evaluate these different kinds of interventions on. And the kind of things that Hope mentioned were in there. But I think what's really crucial and often neglected is what happens to the local people on the ground. Because very often, take the case of stratospheric aerosol or marine cloud brightening, which people tend to think of as global interventions, but most likely a lot of these things would be done for engineering reasons and actual intervention value in places like the Arctic or the Antarctic, where there are people, and they, of course, have to be taken into account very strongly, not just taken into account, but they're not going to go for it unless there's actual tangible benefits for those local people. And I think, Tyler, that was a bit missing in your presentation, that you didn't really. I think what we've found from actually being there and trying to do things in Greenland is that you have to have the local people very much involved from the earliest stage.
Yes, yeah, great point, John. I agree. I think we had that. So in that the Venn diagram, the governance involved multiple interactions with the public at large, but it could certainly get down into the weeds of each individual community. There could also be citizen-based science doing some monitoring as well.
My question on, I guess, atmospheric interventions in terms of public engagement is if the atmosphere is considered like a global commons or an international commons, who exactly is the community when everyone is the community? And then so it's really like this problem of trying to account for everyone the same way that deep seabed mining does. Whereas like more targeted interventions to a specific location, you kind of have an idea of who you need to engage. But yeah, that seems to be a difficult question for atmospheric intervention.
But even if you do an atmospheric intervention, you are going to launch it from somewhere, and it's designed to have a particular impact. So, for example, we had a co-create meeting in London a month ago, and we were trying to figure out how you might want to manage a field test. And the point is that these field tests, whether you're talking about aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening or somewhere, they are done in specific locations. So I like how the Great Barrier Reef intervention has very much involved local people, and it's something that is very clearly a goal that everyone can strive for, which is to save the reef. So there's a lot of obvious customers for it. There's much less customers for, hey, we want to do a test of injecting some aerosols into the stratosphere over your village, because there's not going to be any benefits at all. And so, you know, in a way, it might be easier to sell it in terms of we think we could lower the category 5 hurricanes hitting the east coast of the US if we did something over the main development region in the tropical Atlantic. You know, at least people could then say, well, you know, it's whatever the $5 billion or whatever it was expected to have cost the last storm. So that it could generate some customers. It doesn't have to be done. Like, for example, the Greenlanders, when we talked about doing an intervention in Ilulissat, their response, or one of their responses was, why do we want to do it in Ilulissat? Why don't we do it in Paris for Notre Dame or you know, some Statue of Liberty or something like that? Do it where the rich guys are to kind of prove it's safe with them instead of the people on the margins.
I think a systemic way to look into this could be if you put like the intensity or the scale of the intervention and then some spatio-temporal impact to different axes, then you're gonna have different communities that fit in different places. So this is not intervention based. This is a lot in the details. So a small intervention in terms of like a spatial disruption, but that lasts a long time. It's going to involve today's community, but tomorrow's society as well. And then your question of like who do we involve becomes obviously harder. They're not born, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. But also you can have an intervention that is pretty big, but lasts a couple of years, including impacts and everything. Then your community is only today, but now it moves from like local communities to global communities. So I think trying to think of like the community space from the perspective of how the interventions actually are performed. It also applies to pretty much everything that we're doing. No? We are thinking of monitoring and we're thinking of everything as if technologies are monolithic. But it really is up to us to implement it in which scale and whichever way we want to, and the way we do it will affect different people at different times and in different places.
Yeah, I had two follow-ups. One for Hope's initial or one of your comments on the lack. Well, with SAI and global atmospheric interventions, it does remain the Wild West. It seems that there is no governance of it. Even if that never is created, one of the benefits of monitoring, the very low-hanging fruit of monitoring, is that it might seem to be relatively easier to create some sort of monitoring arrangement, having nothing to do with governance, but just from a scientific basis to say, we now understand the stratosphere better, we understand what's going on, and it might contribute to future governance deployment, to creation. And then the second point was actually a question of John, and related to this portfolio approach. The 60 methods that might help in the Arctic. I'm just curious how you see those going forward. Will there be this testing of those? Will they be tested and winnowed down to say 10, or do you think what will be the process going forward where those are chosen, where things rise to the top and things are more rejected?
So we've got a process ongoing now with led by the Sami Council, but it's going to be, we have two parallel tracks, an indigenous perspective and a kind of traditional science, which we are recruiting people to sort of do a mini IPCC expert assessment.
Okay.
And to be perfectly honest, you could put a red line through 40 of these ideas and, you know, they're obviously crazy.
Okay.
I'll say that, you know, let's see. But we don't want to narrow it down too much. I mean, we want to keep it reasonably open, but we have funding, and there is an active website now that's just last week or so kicked off called climateinterventions.org, where we put all these on. And the idea is it's a living process. So people come up with new ideas, old ideas we hope can be just scrapped and not heard of again. But I think this indigenous perspective, this is our kind of theory that we want to get the Sami Council that we have good relations with to provide a way into the Arctic Council through their 5 indigenous members. And instead of trying to do this through the capitals of the Arctic 8 countries, we can do it more from these indigenous grassroots peoples going up in that respect. It remains to be seen if these indigenous groups like any of them. Perhaps they're all going to be unacceptable. But I kind of doubt it, because I mean, I was on a panel a few months ago in the summer where there was the president of the Sami Parliament of Finland, and there was the scientific leader of the Sami Council, and me discussing Arctic interventions. So I mean, it's obvious in the Arctic that change is happening very quickly. So people are aware of it, and they're not like anti-research or anti-knowledge, but they very much want their perspective to be included in any future directions.
And on that note, I'm just going to step in for a second, and I want to slightly shift the framing of the conversation to the mega engineering side of things and John's presentation. And I do have a question that I want to ask, but I'll open it up to the floor first in case anybody has any particular prompts they want to take. No? Excellent. In that case, I get to ask my question. So John, you mentioned a couple interesting things to me. The importance of science, and and you mentioned, bringing in people with thinking about biology. And, when we talk about engineering and mega projects, anytime we build a project, in most developed countries most countries have an environmental impact assessment process, which is, this legal thing. And that often requires huge amounts of ecology and environmental science data and biology data. So how do we, address that, getting that sort of data on the mega engineering level of things when you're talking about scopes and scales that, environmental impact assessments aren't really built for? And I know we have at least one lawyer in the participants today. How legally does that change? What are the law implications of when you have a mega project that probably spans multiple boundaries and has all these other issues in terms of, what does the law say in terms of environmental impact assessments when you're doing it at a larger scale?
Yeah, I think the thing is to not start at that massive large scale. We are very much, and I think all of those 60 ideas, they're at this technological readiness stage 2 or something like that, extremely low level. We would hope to get some of them up to something like a TR4 or 5, which is like a demonstration project within the next 2 or 3 years. But while we're at this level, realistically, they are not transboundary interventions. So you would be governed by existing environmental impact rules. I think the clear thing is, of course, to know what the legal framework is locally where you're trying to do this, and to make sure that you aren't breaking any of those things. But you have to go beyond that legal necessity, because there have been interventions. This ICE 911, for example, upset a lot of people. They had all the legal permits about putting these little glass beads on the surface of sea ice, but they didn't do the correct amount of social license with the local communities. And that made everybody very angry, and they set their project back 5 years, probably at least, which is in contrast with the people at Real Ice, for example, working in Cambridge Bay, who actually sold this idea to the local communities as, here's a way that sea ice can be safer for you guys to travel on. So there was clear local benefits, and the local community took an active role in advising where the intervention was done and monitoring the equipment and even doing some measurements there. And I think that's clearly a much better way of doing it. And I think it's a huge mistake to kind of go into these massive kind of overview things. You have to start small. In practice, all the engineers want to start small, and the scientific feasibility needs more data to put into the models to know if it's going to work at scale. So I think no one is really going to try to suddenly launch a fleet of planes putting aerosols into the stratosphere. One of the biggest kind of scale field tests that we could think of in London was basically a Boeing 777 filled with the sulfur aerosol spray fuel, and that would be something like the kind of, you could do that. That would be 1 day's worth of injection, but if you continued for a year, that would be something like the kind of levels that you would get in a deployment. But again, that would be, of course, a very, very localized, even at the scale of thousands of, well, whatever it would be. Anyway, many tons to be putting in the atmosphere. And then when it comes to large-scale deployment, you know, there was a very useful paper Ted Parson wrote with Corbett about the Antarctic Treaty, for example, and doing interventions there. And what he showed is that you could actually do quite a lot at the beginning stage. But to do a full-scale intervention, you definitely need to rewrite these treaties. And these can easily be the slowest thing, which is why we kind of want to push all of these aspects at the same time. It would be a mistake to go ahead with the engineering without taking part of the treaties or the economic developments and mechanisms. Yeah, that's clear.
So one little thing that I just want to also follow up on is, you know, for those of you who went to things like the GRC conference in Italy this last February, you know, we were starting to see a greater diversity of research. You know, there's quite a few interesting papers from the Global South, and in particular, a lot of really interesting pieces on things like impacts to agriculture and farming. Yet, to my recollection, you know, there still wasn't a single paper, at least in the SRM space, on sort of really dedicated biological and ecological impacts. And so how do we start getting those researchers involved? Because, you know, that is vital information, you know, especially if we want to proceed to even a small scale environmental impact assessment. You have to have that data and information. And, you know, there was just, you know, the ETC group just published a thing talking about how degrees was bad. Still not quite clear on their argument, but that's fine. But it's like, okay, so we can't just create a new organization that has funding to try and, you know, get people to do research just by saying, hey, here's money. So how do we incentivize researchers that have this vital knowledge to get involved, that's not sort of, you know, financially coercive or otherwise?
Jane Flegel has this point she used to make. I don't want to say she still doesn't or holds it, but it was an idea along the lines of like, is there really a demand for the science that we want? And that demand is not by other scientists. The demand is by the people. And if you want to get people involved into researchers involved into doing research on this, maybe we need to ask the question, who wants this research to happen? And just like John was saying, maybe we need to ask people where's the type of research they need to know, so that people on the ground, the information they want to know, so that they can actually make decisions about it, rather than like, we need these decisions to run our models, or this information to run our experiments, or even to get a project approved. If people don't even want that project, no. So I do agree with the Bachem on that area and the importance, and I think as we move more towards more localized impacts of climate change in general and try to understand them better, and climate interventions in particular, most of these new questions are going to show up. And I think we haven't seen them because the questions were not there yet. People are asking like larger questions and more like global analysis with dimming the sun or whatever. So I've seen actually more people doing this, like Colin Carlson is doing research on this, and Christopher Treases is doing research on that stuff that you were saying, for example. But it's still pretty global. It's not local. Anyways, I think we have this tendency to assume that because we don't know something, people wants to know about it, and maybe they don't.
I have a question on the glacial interventions. So I've read like over your previous work, and you're like, I'm convinced by the argument that it's cheaper for this project than it is for sea level rise to deal with the consequences of sea level rise. But my question still is like, who pays for this type of intervention? And does historical responsibility and those kind of considerations come into who would pay, or is it just like whoever wants to put forward the money and those kind of economic questions?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a very good question. Basically, we had two ideas. One might be that the insurance business might be interested because they haven't a clue how much premiums to charge for people for flood risk in future, both, increased hurricane surges, but also mean sea level rise. Like a 30 centimeter rise in sea level changes the extreme flood risk by a factor of 100, which is pretty severe. So that might be something. The other thing we've been assuming is that you could do something like a REDD+ type of scheme, which pays people to avoid chopping down old growth forests. But the problem with that is that it's done in a domestic state situation. So the government pays for the farmers not to cut it down. And of course, that doesn't work in the situation of Greenland, basically 56,000 people there. And it wouldn't make sense for, say, Denmark to pay Greenland to preserve it, even though Denmark would be one of the beneficiaries. And the other point is that it's different from essentially telling people to sit back and do nothing instead of going out and doing forestry, because you would actually need to do active work to maintain the ice sheets. If you do nothing, they will go away pretty dramatically. So things would need to be built and maintained. And I think that would be likely sit a lot better with public in the US or Europe, to think that you're actually paying for people to do something positive. But I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. You would think, and kind of we show it's maybe a few percent to prevent the sea level rise than it is to deal with the consequences of the sea level actually rising. So common sense wise tells you that it's worth doing something, but whether that actually works in practice, I'm not an expert on that field.
I had maybe not quite a similar question, but something I wanted to relate to a bit of what Hope was asking. So when we were kind of planning some questions, this was originally going to be one that I had asked to Juan, but I think it really could go for any of you. As a current PhD student who's just chipping away at readings all the time, I was wondering how you thought that theories and challenging the existing epistemological and ontological frameworks that we use to shape our science and our engagement practices might be leveraged in new ways to facilitate cross-disciplinary cooperations and help to deploy CDR, nets, or other interventions, and also how that might feed into like facilitating cross-sector cooperations as well. I guess my thought was also in a similar vein. This is the thing that connects my thought to hope, as I said it earlier, was that like, how do we talk to people in like doing ESG stuff, like doing sustainable finance, and get other people to speak the same language as us? Because I think that it's often really easy to get caught up in not the opposite of our disciplinary silos, but assuming that everybody else is thinking about other disciplines and how they factor in together, when that's not necessarily true, or certainly isn't true in a lot of really interesting discussions I've had recently. And also maybe how that kind of theory or ontological shift might play into public engagement. So I know I've said a lot there, so I'm going to stop talking, but
you know that there is actually a really good point. I was reading recently this book called Tribal, which is just about that, like how humans are tribal animals. And in the book, it actually, just quickly, just getting to an answer to you, is it's better to, you said like, how do we get people to speak our language? And he actually said that's always like a bad strategy. The best strategy for you to speak theirs. So the question is like, how do you reach out to sustainable finance people talk about this, so that and then how to understand their perspective, so that yeah, so how do you understand their perspective so that you make a case for their research to touch on these important aspects? Nobody naturally arrived to it. When I started doing research on solar geoengineering, for example, it wasn't about solar geoengineering at all. It was about, like, I was thinking differently about environmental economics. I was like, what if we move this other thing in environmental economics? And I was curiosity about how it affects the way I think about my research. And sometimes you just can point out to other people, but I think if you really think, or if we really think that we need to reach out to them, then we are the ones that need to make the case in their field, like, to not for them to come here, but how do you actually introduce this into their field with their jargon, with their understanding, with their frameworks. That's how, for example, I also entered in. I think John and I are in a very similar path, although probably John had arrived there before even I started working at. But that's how I landed on community center research. It was like a complete flip for me. Like, I want people in communities to understand solar geoengineering at that level. And that meant for me to retrain and retool and move into that area, which I haven't quite gotten, obviously, because I just started. So yeah, it's a good point that we were doing this when we were doing the National Academy of Science report on solar geoengineering. We have these metrics of like disciplines that work on the topic, and then we had larger metrics, or like disciplines that don't work on the project, and which questions are important that could be addressed by those. So that, I don't know if actually that made it into the report, but I think I was like, Kate, Ricky, and I were working on that. And I think that was a really good thing. There was a bunch of holes, let's say, a bunch of questions that are not answered, and a bunch of disciplines that are not participating. But I think building the case means like asking the questions for them and say like, hey, are you interested? But yeah, the main holes, I think they're non-disciplinary. I think we don't know much about engineering because we are not allowed in larger projects, or not allowed, but people have not been into that yet. And we don't know a lot of anthropological places, for example, anthropological studies of large interventions, because nobody has taught them. But we should. I don't know if that answers your questions or at all is related to it, but if anything comes out of this comment, read Tribal. It's a really good one.
I'm just going to step in for a second there as well.
I like a good book back always.
On that note, I'm going to shift the conversation one last time to Tyler's talk about monitoring, reporting, and verification. And as Tyler mentioned, several of us actually got to be involved in some of the early stages of that workshop and paper. And I mean, I think I speak for all of us when I say we're very excited to see where that goes. But for those who weren't involved, I'd really like to hear other people's takes on what he spoke about and the challenges going forward, and opening it up to the floor once again.
Yeah, I kind of have a point, but it's maybe a little bit abstract because I know now we're talking about, okay, let's not think on such a mega level. Let's scale it back, but my brain automatically goes the other way. So I'm thinking about if we take a portfolio approach and we do multiple interventions. So we have stratospheric aerosol injection, we have glacial interventions, we have ocean-based interventions, and traditional CDR methods. Like, what about monitoring all of those? Because then they're each going to start affecting each other. And so how do you account for that when there's multiple? Because I feel like monitoring, reporting, and verification right now is being developed in a siloed approach where we're thinking, okay, how do I monitor this specific technology against the already complex baseline, shifting baselines? But now we also have to add on, okay, we're adding even more interventions, and that's going to shift baselines even more, and the interactions between them. So I was just wondering if there's been any thought about monitoring across interventions.
Yeah, that was one of the main complications exactly of our discussions. We decided to focus on SAI just because it's the most prominent and might be the most well studied at this point. But how would a monitoring system that's geared toward SAI also include MCB or cirrus cloud thinning? So the satellites might be able to be tweaked for both instances, but then the scientists, there's the stratospheric scientists and then the cloud scientists, and what are you watching? So in terms of in like pre-deployment intelligence, are you watching the airports or are you watching ports for the ships? Could a monitoring system incorporate all of that? Possibly. So that's one of the outstanding questions. What we did decide on, or at least for this initial take, is that we could separate the CDR out as a greenhouse gas monitoring separate system, which actually there might be much better systems in place for that right now. So we are focused on solar radiation modification. And I just mentioned it though. One of the main questions that we also struggled with was to what extent would such monitoring be done by national intelligence agencies versus scientific bodies? And we need to understand more the example of the nuclear weapons non-proliferation monitoring systems, where a lot of the monitoring might happen from a national intelligence agency, and that information is somewhat transferred over to, say, the IAEA. To what extent can a monitoring, and yet we want this goal where the data is transparent. We want to know this country is doing this, and this country is doing that. We want to get down to the nitty gritty. They're launching so many planes at this altitude, and they're using this particle in an idealized setting. How do you do that without involving spy capabilities? And that's a really difficult question.
But you were talking about Tyler, verification and monitoring on the deployment, not on the impacts, no? When you, like in your response.
Oh, yeah. So that was another fuzzy line. So we in terms of the timeline, we're pushing monitoring towards very early monitoring, meaning before it even happens. On the far side on the right side of the timeline, where you're looking at impacts, that's an ongoing bit of debate and discussion amongst the group. Does monitoring include an assessment of what's going on, or is it just we're seeing this intervention happen, we see that radiative forcing is being affected, we see that the climate's being affected, and we see temperatures changing. Or is monitoring also, and what is the effect of that then, on local rainfall, say? So it certainly can be extended, or there's this idea of having the monitoring system be very compartmentalized, and then taking that information, having it be verified, and then passing it off to the science, to the impact scientists. Finally, the goal though is for governance. It's not monitoring for the purpose of science, it's monitoring for the purpose of managing such a deployment.
Yeah, I think that is a really cool differentiation. Otherwise it's intractable if you measure the whole thing. But I think to the point of hope, and even in the way you were describing it, there is this recent paper that shows that air quality affects night readings on satellites, and that so even in this very simple thing like, oh, satellites can do this, actually is no, because if you do Marie Claude brining, then the reading of the satellite that is reading the temperature is gonna be different, or reading that's reading the albedo, well, that one obviously is gonna be different. But if you do CDR, also you separate it. I think that another clever way to do it, but also CDR will also affect those other measurements as well, no? Even if it is just greenhouse gases, just because greenhouse gases also have climate component that is not only temperature driven, no? So yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and one of the things I didn't mention, well, partially, is this idea of triangulation of different ways to look at the same bit of data, that especially if a deployer is not being cooperative and open with or transparent with what they're doing, is that looking at different ways of trying to assess what is actually happening. And even if they are being cooperative and transparent, verifying those numbers with other numbers, and numbers taken from this lab and numbers taken from that satellite and numbers taken from here, to really get the best information possible.
And in the hope of transparency, also highlight the possible pitfalls that come with the monitoring, and highlight what is difficult and what is not capturing and things like that. And
but how does this thing work with a system that would have a feedback controller? So that the idea is that you would be continuously changing the emissions at different latitude bands, with the idea of reaching some sets of targets. And of course, they may not be, pole to equator temperature gradient or something like that. They might be Arctic sea ice, or, hurricanes in the Atlantic or something of that type. And those kind of things are very, to be of any use, they have to be responsive, that people change as they move along. So collecting adequate data is a scientific requirement first and foremost, otherwise you simply can't do a sensible intervention. But it sounds like you're trying to treat it as a kind of the comprehensive test ban thing, where people are secretly doing nuclear explosions or something like that. But there'd be I can't see a reason why anyone would secretly want to deploy an aerosol in the stratosphere.
Yeah, the secret, that was another issue of contention in our discussions. The idea of a secret deployer, while possible, the consensus was that they would be detected fairly quickly. The benefit though was just to get a little leg up on some sort of diplomatic efforts, to say that, yeah, and this would be detected fairly. It could be detected even with just conversations with people that such and such a country is planning to do this, but just to know what is happening. In terms of tweaking or managing the system, that's out of my area. But I look to people like Doug McMartin and others who've looked at those initial 10 years where if a deployment is done responsibly, it would happen slowly, but in the meantime, the climate variability would trump any signal that's detectable, and therefore it'd be very hard to actually tweak it in, say, a Bayesian sense. But that would be the goal eventually, to be able to know that yes, we're doing this deployment, these particles, this altitude, and we've been doing it for these years, and there's so many tons, and it's precipitating out this way, and we've noticing some effects, and we see this is what we see.
I see. Okay, now I get it. So it's like a sort of stock taking to know exactly what we're doing,
Yes,
and therefore, yeah, right. Well, that's very sensible. Yeah, absolutely.
that's a good phrase, stock taking. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in for 1 second here. I see, I know we've got 2 people in the audience who haven't contributed anything yet. Hermano or Jonathan, do either of you feel like unmuting and putting in some questions or comments?
Well, they have contributed with their presence. They just haven't been vocal.
I can say something. Thank you for this. Well, first, it's a pleasure to meeting all of you, and I just would like to endorse what before John and Moreno and Stephanie said, in the sense that I think if in order to move forward, we really need to kind of understand different ontoepistemologies, both from a legal perspective, but also from a scientific perspective. And so about the importance of kind of questioning our own understanding of science or of law, and kind of making the necessary efforts to embrace what different visions of 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 science, or of how the social relation works, or of our relation with nature, then apply to the social structure of other populations, such as the indigenous in the north. And so I really like what John said before about, starting with small steps, and the importance of moving slowly together. I think also togetherness is another point that is important to take into consideration when approaching solar geoexperiment, or in general geoengineering experiment. And so, yeah, this is my 2 cents, but thank you so much for the interesting discussion.
John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, really interesting discussions. I got a sense from Tyler and John's kind of perspectives that they're looking at sort of near medium term steps need to be taken to roll out some of these interventions. And I've been thinking a bit lately about like a more like planetary health kind of perspective and how that might inform some of these. Like when I think of interventions, I immediately think of like doctors working on patients and trying to think about the overall health of the body. And this seems like it's scaled up to a planetary level, which includes things like how to ensure cooperation and right institutions. So are there any, I was curious that analogy makes any sense here, and especially when we're thinking about interventions and the kind of training, knowledge, epistemologies that doctors kind of have to go through in their training versus what the sort of burgeoning field of climate engineering interventions is trying to work towards.
I think that's a very useful analogy, actually. And of course, lots of people are very scared by, for example, surgery. And I think one thing that and they are by geoengineering. And in a sense, talking about geoengineering is like wheeling a conscious patient into the operating theater and showing them all the tools of the trade. They were a lot more serious about living a healthy life and avoiding some of those potential surgeries. So I think that it is a useful analogy. And to push that analogy further, you can't kind of cure a patient against his wishes. So it's super important, I think, to try to build this consensus and try to get to sort of remove the fear and to have a normal discussion about what these interventions actually mean. Let's try and look at this rationally instead of just purely emotionally, and see where we are. And then I just wanted to briefly, we haven't got much time, but in terms of this kind of portfolio approach, it may very well be that, kind of none of these measures work on their own. In a sense, it's a bit like Kim Stanley Robinson in the Ministry of the Future, and they try to do a stock take 100 years from now, and it's like a litany of failure. But maybe if you have 100 failures, somehow together they add up to a success, because each little bit is just part of a wedge that gets you into this healthier planet than what we have at the moment. So I think it's that we don't need to find the magic bullet, but we need to have a rational discussion about what tools we've got in the box that might fix what's wrong.
Yeah, and just plug in my own work, John, if you're interested, work with Kate Rickey too. We have something that is called geo wedges, and it's like a portfolio approach to engineering environment. And it's that whole idea. Every technology has different characteristics. Some are good, some are bad, some are useful, some aren't. When you combine them, then you end up with like a complex combination of things that might not be terrible, or might be actually be good too. I want to add to this idea of the human body as an analog, but from the perspective of the medical discipline of the doctors. And it is that each doctor comes in with an idea of what is wrong with the patient. And usually they want different approaches that they defend. As the approach, a surgeon who's gonna want to do surgery, a family doctor might ask you questions about your diets and relations and how you handle your blood pressure and exercise. And then, so different people with expertise on different organs of your body are gonna try something different. But they don't do that in large part because, like you said, you have consent over what is gonna happen in your body, but also because they consult, like difficult cases are actually dealt with by a group of doctors together, which links to this idea Stephanie was raising, like bringing a lot of people under the same conversation to deal in the same case. Not because everybody needs to know everything, it's because the bits that we know very well only fit in a very small part of the knowledge base. Engineers, I'm an electrical engineer, and now an economist, we have very different ways to look at the world. I have looked very differently at the world as an engineer, as an economist, for example. And that matters, obviously, to enhance the solution. So yeah, I think that the body as a planet is good, but the doctors as the disciplines that are, and then that is also a good extra or a good addition to that analogy.
So we're just about out of time here. So I was actually going to ask Vanessa to maybe give us a last few closing thoughts before we end for the day. And I mean, of course, hope to continue this discussion in other venues in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Burgess. And thanks once again to all of the panelists and also participants for joining in and posing your questions and sharing your thoughts. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I liked how there were a number of challenging perspectives that I feel like I don't hear often enough, such as how it's really important to remember that these whatever strategies it is that we use, and if we resort to using different climate interventions, we need to remember how people are going to be impacted by these different strategies. And yeah, it's very easy to get very caught up in the elite conversations, right? With respect to how I opened everything, talking about, UN Framework Convention and international negotiations and so on and so forth. But to remind us that, especially when we're experimenting with novel technologies, we really need to go back to the communities who might actually deploy them, or the communities where there might be some sort of change in the impacts of climate change that they experience, and have them be involved. So I very much liked that was a thread throughout the conversations. Also, I'm going to definitely check out how John mentioned climateinterventions.org as a new resource for us to take a look at. So I wanted to highlight that as well. And another thing that I also enjoyed was how the conversation touched on this theme of we may need a portfolio approach. We already understand when it comes to mitigation policy that there is no silver bullet. We're going to have to do a portfolio. That might also be true with respect to climate interventions. And so something that Tyler mentioned in his presentation is how it would be important to support adaptive policy learning. And I do feel like that is yet another frontier that we're trying to improve our governance through having an adaptive approach. And so this seems to be another frontier for us to continue to work on as governance scholars. So yeah, thanks once again for your time today. And yeah, and we hope to see you at another meeting, perhaps talking about these sorts of topics in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
It's great to see
Thanks, all.
everybody. Great discussion.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Glad to see you
thanks.
all.
Bye all.